his arrival in the House last Congress. He's been an outspoken advocate for conservative policy proposals at home, while claiming ground as an articulate hawk on our security challenges abroad. His skepticism of the president's posture toward Iran, his strong support for America's relationship with Israel, and his leadership on renewing America's strength and leadership overseas have identified him as an emerging leader in our movement. More importantly, his personal experience as a combat infantry officer with completed combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan have informed him on our very real and personal level the nature of our enemies overseas. I think one thing that I actually think is pretty important to note here, we are very excited. We were very excited when we found out that he was coming to the Senate. As you may have read some clips about his race, and one of the things that I kept seeing recurring in some of these clips was some grumbling. And there was grumbling. There was one quote from a GOP consultant who complained that his voting record looked like a Heritage Action scorecard. And they were grumbling about it because they felt like he was putting himself in unnecessary political peril and made it harder for them to win a seat. But what has been so wonderful to see has been how Senator Cotton was able to go home to his constituents and articulate why he voted against a $1 trillion farm bill in an ag-heavy state, and how his constituents who care about ag embraced him and saw through a lot of the smokescreens that his opponent wanted to put up. He took a lot of hard votes, but he proved that when you take hard votes in Washington, the American people are more than willing to listen to you when you go home and articulate why you stood on principle. And then they'll rally to your side. So for that reason, we are pretty pumped to have him around because he proves the point that we've all been trying to make. And then last but not least, he's also a Heritage intern. A former Heritage intern, so one of our most distinguished interns, I would say the most distinguished intern. So congratulations. Please join me in welcoming Senator Cotton.
Appreciate it. Thank you, and thank you all for the kind welcome. Thank you for the generous introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today to discuss a grave and continuing threat to America's national security, Iran's quest to become a nuclear power. A new Congress and a new majority was just sworn in. For many, these are heady and new times. But America's national security interests don't change with new Congresses or new majorities. It is the duty of leaders in both parties to protect these interests, always. For this reason, Congress will soon step up in one form or another and pass new Iran Sanctions legislation. But we must not forget that legislation is not an end in itself. Sanctions are merely a means to stop Iran from becoming or obtaining nuclear weapons capabilities. It's not enough to stop Iran from getting the bomb. They must never be allowed to possess nuclear weapons capabilities of any kind. To understand why, before getting into the details of new sanctions legislation, we must remember who Iran is, what's at stake with respect to our policy towards Iran, and why President Obama's policy has failed to protect our interests. First, let's make no mistake about the nature of the regime we're dealing with. Iran is a radical, Islamist, tyrannical regime. Upon coming to power, among its first actions was to invade sovereign American territory, our embassy in Tehran, and to hold Americans hostage for over a year, an act of war for which it has never fully answered. The Iranian Constitution states that Iran's army and the Revolutionary Guard Corps, quote, will be responsible for fulfilling the ideological mission of jihad in God's way, that is, extending the sovereignty of God's law throughout the world, end quote. Perhaps more than our own leadership, the Ayatollahs have kept faith with their constitution. Iran has been killing Americans for over 35 years. In 1983, Iran helped finance and direct the bombings of the U.S. Embassy and Marine barracks in Beirut, killing hundreds of military, diplomatic, and intelligence personnel. In violation of all civilized norms, Iran helped plan and direct the hijacking of TWA Flight 847 which resulted in the death of a Navy diver. Iran has been implicated in the 1996 Khobar Tower bombings, which killed 19 Americans stationed at Saudi Arabia at the time. More recently, and more personally for me, Iran is responsible for the killing and maiming of thousands of American troops in Iraq and in Afghanistan. During my tour in Baghdad, Iran supplied the most advanced and most lethal roadside bombs being used against coalition forces. My soldiers and I knew that Iranian-supplied bombs were the one thing that our armored vehicles couldn't withstand. All we could do was hope that it wasn't our day to hit one. My platoon was lucky, but too many others were not. And to this day, President Obama's negotiating partner continues to collaborate in Afghanistan to kill American forces. Of course, Iran conducts many of these operations against America and our allies through terrorist proxies, as Iran remains the worst state sponsor of terrorism in the world, according to President Obama's own State Department. Iran is a lead financier and arms supplier to Hamas, Hezbollah, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, vile terrorist organization dedicated to destroying Israel. Iran has supported opposition Islamists in Yemen, and Iran has thousands of fighters on the ground today to prop up Bashar al-Assad's outlaw regime in Syria. Now, while Iran likes to boast that it has joined the fight against the Islamic State, it's done so only to protect Assad and has threatened to attack U.S. forces currently fighting against the Islamic State in Iraq if they were to target the Assad regime. Iran also holds hostage to this day, with impunity, multiple American citizens. Robert Levison has been held hostage for nearly 8 years, the longest hostage in American history. Pastor Saeed Abedini, who committed the grave sin in the eyes of Iran's Ayatollahs of converting from Islam to Christianity, today suffers in a notorious Iranian prison for preaching the gospel of Jesus. Amir Hekmati, a decorated American Marine and veteran of Iraq, was arrested in Iran while visiting his family there. And Jason Rezaian, a Washington Post correspondent, was detained just months ago for the apparent crime of committing journalism. Speaking of the press, much of the civilized world watched in horror last week as Islamist terrorists murdered journalists at Charlie Hebdo and Parisian Jews. But let's not forget that it was Iran who made it fashionable first to target for death in the name of Islam the practitioners of a free press and free speech. When Salman Rushdie published the Satanic Verses in 1988, it was Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, who issued a fatwa calling for the killing of Rushdie and his publishers. Think about that for a moment. Head of state put a bounty for murder on the head of a celebrated and prominent author. Khomeini's loyal successor and the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has reiterated this bounty. Yet this outlaw regime is now a negotiating partner of the United States. This catalog of Iran's crimes against the United States and the civilized world, and that was only a sampling, demands a policy of strength and courage towards Iran. But President Obama's policy has been marked by weakness and appeasement. Of course, then Senator Obama foreshadowed this policy in the 2008 campaign, saying that he would meet Khamenei without precondition. Here are his words. We're willing to talk about certain assurances in the context of them showing some good faith. I think it's important for us to send a signal that we are not hell-bent on regime change, just for the sake of regime change, but expect changes in behavior. And there are both carrots and there are sticks available to them for those changes in behavior. Regrettably, President Obama quickly followed through on his promise not to pursue regime change in 2009. Just months into his presidency, the Iranian people rose up in protest against rigged elections in what became known as the Green Revolution. President Obama should have met publicly with Iranian dissidents and, along with regional allies, assisted the pro-freedom elements in the opposition movement. Instead, he stood idly by as regime thugs murdered, rounded up, and tortured many freedom-loving Iranians. President Obama thus lost his first best chance to stop the Ayatollah's nuclear aggression. This failure started an all-carrot and no-stick policy towards Iran. President Obama was dragged kicking and screaming by Congress toward tighter sanctions against Iran. Like a love-struck teenager, he has sent 4 secret letters to Ayatollah Khamenei, unreturned and unrequited. Even worse, President Obama sought a meeting with Iran's second-rate leader, President Hassan Rouhani, last September in New York during the United Nations General Assembly, and Rouhani stiffed him. President Obama then accepted a phone call with Rouhani, the first contact between our country's presidents in 35 years, a tremendous victory for Iran for which the U.S. received nothing in return. Worst of all, of course, are the ongoing nuclear negotiations with Iran. The so-called Joint Plan of Action with Iran was signed in Geneva just over a year ago. Matters have gotten worse since then. The negotiations have now been extended twice, giving more concessions to Iran with little to show in return, despite Secretary of State John Kerry saying in September of 2013 that a deal could be reached in 3 to 6 months. Now, Secretary Kerry sings a different tune. He has backtracked from any timetable, saying recently, quote, "This takes time, the stakes are high, the issues are complicated and technical, and each decision affects other decisions." Meanwhile, based on published reports, U.S. negotiators have surrendered repeatedly to Iran's demands, conceding a right to enrich uranium, allowing Iran to keep its plutonium-producing reactor, asking only that its centrifuges be disconnected instead of dismantled, permitting research and development into advanced centrifuges, excluding the military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program and its ballistic missile program from the scope of the negotiations, and even agreeing to an expiration date for any final deal. In return for all of these concessions to Iran, the U.S. has given and will give billions of dollars in sanctions relief. What's wrong with this picture of negotiations? What started as an unwise policy has now descended into a dangerous farce. One can only suspect an unspoken entente between the Obama administration and Iran. The U.S. won't impose new sanctions on Iran and will allow it to develop threshold nuclear capabilities, while Iran won't assemble a bomb until 2017. But the world cannot accept Iran as a nuclear threshold state, and the consequences of a nuclear Iran are clear. First, we should put nothing past this rogue state, including a direct strike on the little Satan, Israel, or the great Satan, America. Nor should we think Iran would hesitate to provide nuclear materials and technology to its terrorist proxies. Of course, Sunni Arab states like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE likely will not countenance such a radical imbalance of power with their Shia Persian rival. They would likely seek nuclear weapons of their own, and they have the means to acquire them. Once that occurs, nuclear proliferations to terrorists, Sunni and Shia alike, becomes all the more likely. Not to mention the risk of radical Islamist revolution in an unstable nuclear region. The consequences, quite literally, are apocalyptic. Future generations may therefore view what happened in Geneva as we have viewed Munich for the last 75 years. What made this moment even worse, though, is that the West appeased Hitler at Munich out of fear and weakness. President Obama capitulated at Geneva, even though the United States was in a position of strength, given the sanctions regime in place at the time. One can only imagine the thinking behind this grievous historic mistake. We thus need a shift in policy toward Iran, to a clear-eyed and hard-nosed policy of strength based on America's interest and the threat posed by Iran. First, the goal of our policy must be clear: regime change in Iran. We cannot and will not be safe as long as Islamist despots rule in Iran. The policy of the United States should therefore be to support regime opponents and promote a constitutional government at peace with the United States, Israel, and the world. This is so because of the nature of Iran's regime is what makes its pursuit of nuclear weapons capability so dangerous in the first place. Few people worry that France is a nuclear state or that Japan is a nuclear threshold state. Why? Because France and Japan are peaceful, constitutional regimes who pose little threat to their neighbors and the broader world. Iran's regime poses a threat not primarily because of its actions, but because of its nature and the first principles on which it acts. Second, the United States should cease all appeasement, conciliation, and concessions towards Iran, starting with these sham nuclear negotiations. Certain voices call for congressional restraint, urging Congress not to act now, lest Iran walk away from the negotiating table, undermining the fabled yet always absent moderates in Iran. But the end of these negotiations isn't an unintended consequence of congressional action. It is very much an intended consequence, a feature, not a bug, so to speak. Third, congressional action should start with crippling new sanctions against Iran. These sanctions should be immediate. They should not be contingent on further negotiations with Iran. On the contrary, Iran is achieving through slow motion all that it might want in a final deal, exploiting the Obama administration's desperation to keep the negotiations alive and for a deal, any deal. It's time for the responsible adults in both parties of Congress to stop this farce. Risking our national security to secure a presidential legacy is an unacceptable compromise. The particulars of new sanctions can be seen in the bipartisan Nuclear Iran Prevention Act, which passed the House in 2013 with 400 votes. That legislation targeted whole sectors of Iran's economy, particularly its oil and gas and banking sectors. Likewise, Senators Kirk and Menendez are working on legislation that would crack down on Iran's oil industry, which continues to violate limits on the volume of oil sold. The Kirk-Menendez proposals would also require President Obama to certify that Iran doesn't finance terrorist groups that have attacked Americans, and would prevent Iran from maintaining low-level nuclear enrichment capabilities. All these terms are much stricter than the current proposed framework of the negotiations with Iran. Fourth, we should stop minimizing the possibility of military action against Iran. The credible threat of force only strengthens our other tools of national power: diplomatic, economic, financial. No one should ever take lightly the prospect of military action. I certainly do not. Only those who have not tasted war's bitter cup would wish another sip. But the surest way to preserve the peace and to prevent war is to be prepared for war, and we must be prepared to do whatever is necessary to stop Iran from obtaining nuclear capabilities. President Obama should make it utterly clear that Iran is not immune from military strikes and that the United States has the capabilities to severely set back Iran's nuclear program, because we do. Unfortunately, this president's promises of military action have rung hollow since he blinked and refused to enforce his own red line against Syria in 2013. Thus, it may be up to the Congress to restore the credible threat of force against Iran. And Congress can do that, not only by imposing new sanctions, but also by offering to transfer advanced weapons like surplus B-52 bombers and 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs to Israel. Perhaps Israel already has the capabilities to retard Iran's nuclear program. I leave that assessment in the capable hands of the government of Israel. But a congressional offer, whether or not accepted, can remove any doubts in the mind of Iran's ayatollahs. Finally, our policy should make clear that there is only one acceptable outcome to the nuclear showdown with Iran: complete, unconditional nuclear disarmament by Iran, subject to unfettered, on-site verification by U.S. and Western officials, along the lines of disarmament by South Africa and Libya. Lesser terms will not fully protect America from the threat posed by a nuclear Iran. Which raises one final important point. President Obama has shown no intent to change his dangerous course, to shift his policy of conciliation and peace through weakness. On the contrary, he started negotiations without congressional input and apparently intends to avoid Senate ratification of any final agreement, if he ever reaches one. This end run would be of a piece with his unlawful amnesty decree, selective enforcement of Obamacare, and his swap of 5 Taliban commanders detained at Guantanamo Bay for an American soldier without congressional notification. But any unilateral agreement with Iran might be his worst abuse yet of his executive power and our constitutional system of checks and balances. The founders specifically required Senate notification of such agreements to protect Americans from rash, unwise executive action, perhaps taken more to secure a legacy than to secure America's interests. Congress should therefore insist, as our new leadership has, that we will vote on any final nuclear agreement with Iran. While our president believes he can go it alone to negotiate this deal, ultimately only Congress has the constitutional power to permanently lift sanctions on Iran. And if the president believes he can go it alone with Iran, Congress should act to prevent him from doing so. Indeed, we might even go so far as legislating that any deal found unacceptable would be undone and void at the start of a new administration. In late 1936, Churchill made a long speech on the years of British appeasement in the face of German rearmament. Churchill observed, quote, "The era of procrastination, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expedients, of delays is coming to a close. In its place, we are entering a period of consequences." So too with us today. As Iran continues its progress towards nuclear weapons capability, as its economy rebounds from earlier sanctions, as its regional influence waxes and as Barack Obama's tenure wanes, our choices will be clarified, and the consequences along with them. Let us not join our ancestors in being asked by future generations, why didn't they do something? Thank you all. I appreciate your time. I wish I could stay for questions, but